Greetings. It's my pleasure to introduce Andrew Welch. Andrew's a generalist. He's been a systems analyst, actor, experiential educator, theatrical set designer, corporate facilitator, medical software specialist, and rescue professional, not to mention town crier. In 2013, Andrew was organizing an event for Transition Town Erin when he learned that our Life, Money, and Illusion tour would be in his area when their meeting was taking place. I was invited to share our stories with his community. KCOR people likely know that Transition Town projects aim to help local communities reduce their carbon footprints by encouraging local shopping, sometimes with a local currency, local food production, skill development for local provision, and among other things, finding satisfaction in living rather than in consumption. It fits well with our living on Earth as if we want to stay perspective and more fun, less stuff. Since that meeting, Andrew has clarified for me a critical point about how our society is organized. It's the thesis of his book, The Value Crisis. Today's value system is ruled by numbers. How much money do people make and spend? GDP is the king of these numbers. Unlike traditional values, there's enough food, enough healthcare, enough housing, and other things like that enrich people's lives. But in the GDP measure of things, there's no enough. They can always be bigger. And so we overwhelm the earth trying to perpetuate the increases of numbers that's supposed to represent human well-being. Andrew encourages people to question his ideas and improve on them. I'm looking forward to hearing Andrew explain the problem of numeric valuation and how a return to the qualitative measurement is needed to solve today's problems. Andrew, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mike. Pleasure to be here. I'm going to be building on a number of things that I have shared with KCOR in the past, but some review might be useful for people who are not familiar with all of these various things. I'm going to make a promise, as I often do in some of my talks right from the start. My promise for this one is that you'll see some economic ideas that you've never seen before. Unless you picked up a copy of my second book, but they are quite new, so I'm always eager for feedback on that. And you'll be challenged to rethink our future prospects, and that's one of the things that's always going to be common to what I now talk about. The general flow of today is going to be, I want to give a really brief overview again of what the value crisis is from my perspective, what that means, why most of the solutions that are coming out will probably fail, and I'm an optimist, so we'll explain that in a bit. And also, I want to talk a little bit about a philosophical transformation. That's what those economic ideas that no one has seen before, just to throw out something to think about in terms of a different way of thinking about economics. And then I'm going to end with what I think should be the best first step that civilization can take. And I think it's something that KCOR should probably throw some weight behind. We'll get to that. But the most important thing out of today, I hope, will be the discussion that will follow. So I'm going to try and keep it a little under my usual, the usual time limit for these talks to try and get more discussion in. So that's the general flow of today. What is the value crisis? Well, you've heard me say it before. I've actually modified it based on feedback from KCOR. The idea that Mike talked about, number-based values. Number-based values are where the number goes up means the value goes up every time. It's money, it's likes, it's followers, it's GDP, it's hits, you name it. More is always better. Those are number-based values. There is nothing like that in nature. It's an entirely human-conceived concept. So the value crisis comes from the fact that there's nothing like that in nature. And allowing number-based values to consistently override all other values is, I believe, our greatest failing. That's what the first book was about, was this idea that you look at climate crisis, you look at the sixth mass extinction, you look at inequality, you look at all of these things that are piling up against us. even I traced it back in an earlier talk to COVID-19. They all have this common root that we base our existence on values where more is always better, and nothing in nature works that way. So this is why I believe, and this is sort of the core of this talk, that unless solutions address that principle, they're not going to work. Eventually, the numbers will catch up to us again, and we'll be right back where we started. So I want to take things off in a slightly different direction than I have in the past, in terms of, instead of comparing number-based values and qualitative values like beauty or honesty or justice or triangularity, whatever you like, things that can't be measured strictly by number, I want to talk about where they overlap. And I do that with three different kinds of wealth. So the first kind of wealth is what we call virtual wealth. It's based purely on math. It's where money resides. It's not just that money is only math, but in fact, you can increase the value by math alone. It requires no input from the world in order to have interest rates and investments growing and trade swaps and derivatives. They're all math-based. So that's what they call virtual wealth. On the other side are the qualitative values that we talked about, but there's some place in the middle where they overlap, and it's called real wealth. Now, real wealth is things like food and shelter and things that exist around us. Those are driven by physics, all right? So we're all familiar with that kind of wealth, but it operates slightly differently from just strictly number-based wealth in that it's a very natural thing. We need it to survive. What's really interesting is how these values change over time. And I want to just talk a little bit about that particular overlap and conflict. We could have a separate talk on this all on its own, but just to keep you aware of the fact that number-based values tend to follow an exponential curve upwards. That's growth. Growth is defined as an exponential curve. And when you have money, it tends to grow exponentially unless you do dumb things with it. People with more money can make even more money faster than those who have less money. So it tends to go upwards. Interesting thing about the physics is that value tends to go downwards. Food rots, cars deteriorate, houses lose value over time. And so one of the interesting things that we get into, which I'm not going to specifically go into today, but it's worth noting, is that when we exchange money, virtual wealth, for real wealth, we're exchanging a value that goes up for a value that goes down, which means that they are entirely incompatible. It's not a fair transaction. And in fact, the world is motivated to turn real wealth, like raw resources and food and so on, into money as fast as they can, because money goes up and real wealth goes down. Interesting thing about that. But when I laid this out, I took a different path rather than exploring the conflict. I wanted to talk about genuine wealth. Can that be graphed? Can you get a visual representation of that? And I've shared this a couple of times in K-Core talks. Yes, you can. And I landed on this by looking at what we call in business polarities. This is the way life itself works, all right? We go from growth and destruction being polar opposites that are constantly in conflict and yet are absolutely necessary for each other. If all nature had would be growth, the planet would be full in a heartbeat, and there would be no room for life to continue. It needs that destruction cycle as well. And there's never a perfect balance of growth or destruction. They move around each other in a constant cycle. So we go from new growth creation to becoming crowded and competitive, going over to renewal and resources available. That's great because we've got destruction happening, but after a while that's seen as a void, it's seen as a loss. We can't have natural growth with just destruction, so we move over into new growth and creation. And what I discovered was that all of the values that I was talking about, the qualitative values, ones that I've given examples of in the past, of justice, art, beauty, they all follow this tension between two competing polarities, two competing poles. So this is something which I consider to be critical to any particular solution of the crisis that humanity's in. If you don't have this cycle, if you have an exponential curve going up or an exponential curve going down, it's not going to work. It's not going to be sustainable. This cycle defines sustainability. I mean, you just look at it. It's obviously going to continue onwards and onwards for thousands of years, whereas an exponential curve upwards or downwards is not. You've got to ask yourself, what is the definition of sustainable, right? Is it sustainable something that's going to last us for the rest of our lives, or the rest of our grandchildren's lives, or for thousands of years? Because if we look at the First Nations populations, they lasted for thousands of years because they were based on this kind of value cycle. All right, so I want to just switch from the screen sharing here over to looking at things with a little more, just swing it back over to the presentation. We'll just move on to the next slide here. Oh, 1 second, excuse me. Alt tab. Okay. Let's talk about some of those solutions that are out there. The donut model you may be familiar with in economics. The UN Sustainable Development Goals. Earth for All is a very exciting one that we had a talk on just a couple of weeks ago. And I looked at these and I was really excited by all of the things that they contain. But I worry that they don't go far enough because they are built within our existing concept of what's good and what's bad, how we measure success. And too many of them are based on this idea of economic success being a measure of value, and not addressing or not sufficiently incorporating those ideas of sustainability and sustainable values working that way. If we look at things like, well, they call them sustainable development goals. Even when you look at the sustainable development goals, you'll realize that there are goals within that list of 17 which are in conflict. The idea of hunger being a sustainable development goal is in conflict with the idea of life on land. Some of these specific things they lay out are in conflict with each other. If you look at the idea of decent work and economic growth, I love this one. Here's the icon for decent work and economic growth going up. That's a sustainable development goal. The one for responsible consumption and production has a familiar curve to it. I like that one. All right. So there are problems here. Let's look at some of the other things about, well, that Earth for All. That was a really exciting one that we had on a couple of weeks ago. One of the problems with that Earth for All concept is that, well, for example, Sandrine said that the will is there. The will is finally there. I think the statistic was 74% of people in the G20 believe that they want to base their policies on sustainable development. They want their government to go in that direction. I question that survey, because if you asked people, do you want your government policies to be based on sustainable development goals? I think easily 74% of them will say, absolutely. Yeah, sounds great. But when it comes to voting, they don't vote for that. There are political parties who have been pushing sustainable development goals for decades now. They're not in power because what the survey perhaps doesn't present well enough is what they're going to have to give up in order to have those sustainable development goals. The things that are a decrease in GDP, A lower standard of living by monetary measures, probably. The effort required, and a big, huge one, the loss of jobs. Jobs drive the economy the way it works now. They have to be there in order for that curve to go up. And if you tell people you're not going to have your job when we start introducing sustainable development goals, forget the green jobs, I get it. If you have nothing but green jobs, all you've got is the same curve going up again. You're trying to build an economy based on something that's got a different resources, but you're still pulling them out of the ground. You have a green economy, you're still pulling rare earth metals out of the ground in order to have your batteries and so on. If the idea was to maintain all the jobs we've got and to keep everybody employed, it's not going to happen within those sustainable development goals. It's just not. So I don't think the will is there. And I think even more importantly, the pushback is going to be huge. And I'm not just talking the fossil fuel companies, and I'm not talking the hugely wealthy people. I mean, let's look at the total world wealth for 8 billion people is $431 trillion, approximately. For 100 companies, 100 corporations, that's $31.7 trillion. Are they going to want to change a system where they are no longer in the powerful position that they're in? I don't think so. 500 people control $5.9 trillion. Are they going to want the system to change where they don't have the power and control that money gives them? I don't think so. We could talk about all the rules that we have in place in the way of regulating things. I might remind you that right now in the United States, there is one senator holding up the appointments for a whole slew of US government key positions. The rules don't apply when people say, I've got the money, therefore, because money trumps everything else, I'm going to push back on these things. So when we talk about Earth for All and so on, these are fantastic goals. They're really exciting progress being made and people talking about stuff, but it's always if we can get the governments to adopt these policies, if we can get people on side, if we can get people to realize that jobs are not as important as keeping the planet alive, that's a huge if. And I'm not optimistic about it in that sense. It's not going to happen that way unless we can orchestrate a value change. We are in the age of misinformation. We're just broaching that huge area of misinformation. The technology is running wild with it. And we're expecting that people are going to be able to tease out the good from the bad. Not when the people who are running the show are the people that tell us what we see, they tell us what we learn, they tell us what we eat, they tell us what we think and what we buy. It's the minority that see past that and can have some sort of sense that they're not being completely controlled by what they value the most, which is the money. That's the goal that everyone at the end of the day tends to have trumped in there somewhere. Okay, so one of the things that I mean, the donut model is a great model because I think it has some of that sense of the two competing aspects of it, the ecological, the social foundation. We have to find that balance in between them. And I thought it would be interesting just to throw in there that I actually saw donut economics as a polarity, okay? So you've got happy people because the social concerns are being looked after. But if the social concerns are being looked after too much, you start to get overshoot. And so when you get overshoot, you start trying to look at ecological concerns, which gives you a happy planet. But when your planet is happy and your ecological concerns are looked after, you might start compromising your social concerns. You've got shortfall. So you go over here. The way the donut model is presented tends to suggest there's a balance. But I think that most things in nature and life don't work by a balance. They work by competing cycles. So I would prefer to see it in that mode. And it's easier to think about it in that mode, because then when you see, oh my goodness, we're failing because we've got overshoot, you say, no, 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 we're just putting a little too much emphasis on social concerns. It's time to, in this particular aspect, for this particular component of the model, look over at the ecological concerns and try and get some balance there with the shortfall. So that's an interesting way of looking at the donut model that I'll just throw out there. So how do we get this value shift where we can be optimistic again about what's going on with some of these major models? It's an attitude shift. It's not a policy shift. It can't be done by policy unless you can change the way the governments are elected and the way the governments are worked and mandated to score themselves. It can't be mandated because it's always going to work against the population in terms of their economic growth and their well-being of jobs and so on. This is a feedback loop. This is a negative feedback loop. It's going to hurt. And so it's got to be an attitude, not a policy. So one of the things I was playing with was I talked about my own attitude towards how I live my life, which is not a quantitative outlook, generally speaking. And I stumbled across this concept, which I call qualitative economics. And the idea is some way that we can introduce qualitative values back into society and civilization without necessarily changing the whole dynamic of the way everything works. Can we, as individuals, live qualitative lifestyles within an economic framework? I didn't think we could. And then I threw out this slide. More fun, less stuff. Mike likes to bring this up a lot in K-Core talks. And people say, well, you know, fun is a kind of a frivolous concept in some respects. But really, to me, that says a lot more than just fun and stuff. That says more action, more qualitative, more happiness, more joy, less numeric measure. How much stuff do I have? How much money do I have? And so on. It's an attitude shift. And so I started to play with this in terms of, well, qualitative economies. I looked at gift economies. And I stumbled on this. This is a slide which I've shown before. And I thought it was a really neat visual way of looking at this. I say a gift is not an object, it's an action. And here's how to think about it. If we think of a gift as being this white thing in the middle here, that's the object. The relationship is the two faces we have on either side. And that is the gift. As much as the object is. It's the relationship. But if we focus too much on the object itself, we no longer see the faces. We no longer see the relationship. So I thought, wait a minute. That says that a qualitative relationship and a quantitative gift can exist at the same time. One is the foreground for the other's background. And I had an interesting story, for example, just one of the stories that's in the book. I tend to write about anecdotes and stories. I was at a chocolate shop buying some chocolates, and I brought my own box because I thought that would be economically or ecologically friendly, and it was a personal thing I wanted to do. And the woman at the shop said, you know, there's a lot of room in this box. I could easily put a fifth one in there. And I said, sure, go ahead, put a fifth chocolate in there, no problem. And when I left the store, I realized she'd only charged me for 4. And I thought, wow, that was a gift. But what a gift. I'll be telling this story for months. I'll be coming back to that shop and so on. She introduced an element of qualitative economics that wasn't quantitative. It was her loss, but it was both of our gains. And so I thought, how can I express this? If it's a positive and negative, maybe it can actually work as a spectrum. So I'm going to read you a little section I've got from the book here as to the spectrum I stumbled upon for how you can make it, under our current economic setting, how you can move from qualitative to quantitative. Here's how you would acquire a book. fully quantitative value system, steal it. That's the best way of getting a book in a quantitative measure. Don't pay for it. Buying a book online because it's cheap. Buying a book from a major chain store. Buying a book from a local independent shop. Borrowing a book from a library. Trading books with a friend. Receiving a book from a friend. You see, we're moving in a qualitative direction here. Receiving a book from a friend with a personal note written inside. Receiving a book from a friend who wrote it. Receiving a book from a friend who wrote it for you. So we have this spectrum that we can move within our current way of living from quantitative to qualitative. Let me give you maybe a more practical example. As a producer of goods, if you're a manufacturer, how would you move from fully quantitative to qualitative within our current market? Fully quantitative, you would produce cheap, one-time use products that are foreign made and sold online. Cheap, poor quality product sold in major chain stores. Medium quality, repairable product sold online. Medium quality, repairable product sold locally. Good quality, durable product sold online. Good quality, durable product sold locally. High quality, beautiful, durable product sold in person. High quality, beautiful, durable product custom made for the buyer. Now you may wonder why, as I move in this spectrum from quantitative to qualitative, why I distinguish between online and local. It's because under a qualitative value system, as we're going to see in a second, the key value is not the money being transacted. The key value is the relationship. The money has to take place in order for the business to survive and for there to be a fair exchange, although frankly it doesn't. Libraries are a qualitative part of the economy. Barter is a qualitative economy. But for the most part, we're still going to be dealing with money. What I was trying to prove was that we could be qualitative. We could have this spectrum without necessarily having to throw money away. And it's just a matter of recognizing where we are on that spectrum and choosing to be in that spot so that we can live a more qualitative lifestyle and gain some of the benefits of qualitative and quantitative values. Now, this next slide, I'm not sure, might not be readable in this particular camera position. I'm going to read it out for you. This idea of quantitative economics, the objective is to increase profit. And that's achieved by raising the price, lowering the quality, increasing demand. All of three of those are subject to the elasticity of the demand, if you're an economist. Increasing automation, decreasing the supply so that you have scarcity. That drives the price up, greater profits. Reducing alternatives, increasing your market coverage so that you've got more people buying it from you. You can do that by eliminating competition as well. And reducing after-sales support and this kind of thing. The basis of quantitative economics is more money for you, or more money for me, less money for you. That's the way quantitative economics works now. This is what I would propose as being an alternative. Qualitative economics, the objective is to increase the quality and the relationship. Because frankly, you enjoy shopping from people you know. You enjoy buying things, you enjoy buying high quality things, and you know that there's a level of trust there that you don't get when you buy online and you buy from a big corporation. So we achieve that by high quality, price flexibility, so that based on the relationship, you can charge a price that's suitable to the relationship that you're in. Personal service, exceeding expectations, local market coverage, because we're keeping it local, and good after-sales support. Again, I live this kind of value. I'll share a little trick that I sometimes use myself, because one of the things I do on the side for people is I sometimes do renovation work and handyman work. A lot of the time, if I do it for really good friends, it's for nothing, because it's a barter. I do things for them, they do things for me, and it's great. That's a whole economy that it doesn't appear in GDP, but it drives things very well. But here's one of the things I do if they're not such a close friend, is I'll write them an invoice for a ridiculously low amount, something that covers my basic costs and recognizes that, you know, they're paying for some work that I did. 9 times out of 10, they say, that's ridiculous. I'm not paying you that. I'm going to pay you more. That's win-win. They're getting a real deal. They're probably still paying less than what they might pay a corporation or a tradesperson that doesn't care. It's only interested in the profit. But they're also accepting the gift from me and the offer, even if they're not going to pay the lower amount. And I've got a win-win because I'm not in it for the money. And even though I submitted for some money, I'm getting more money back. It's just a little trick I use, but it shows that it's possible within our current lifestyle to live in a more qualitative way and emphasize those relationships instead of emphasizing just the money. Okay, so there we are. Let's talk a little bit about some of the policy changes that would be required if the attitude shift is enough that we actually started looking at changing policies. Because I agree with Earth for All and so on, that at the end of the day, you have to change the way the governments operate. You have to change what their mandate is and what their goals are. So some of my favorite policy changes are redefining corporations, redefining ownership, and basic income. Now, a lot of people go, whoa, those are huge. David Korten and Bill Rees talk about this a lot too. These have to be on the table. These are the things that allow the current status quo to continue. These are the things that define those exponential curves upwards and downwards. If these aren't on the table, you are not going to get the change that you need in order to get a sustainable lifestyle and sustainable goals. What do I mean by redefining corporations? Well, here's some fun things to throw out there. Making them not immortal anymore. Corporations used to be set up with a limited lifespan. They had a job to do. They had limited liability needed for that job. And once that job was done, the corporation was shut down. What happens when you have immortality is it starts to run against all of our natural laws of that cycle of regenerating and having the money return to other projects. Having more employees on boards so that you have a slightly different objective of what the company is all about. The company is there to provide employment for people and to give them something to do, something useful and productive to do. Their voices should be at the table. I think legal personhood has to be revisited so that companies can't say, I have the right of free speech. No, you're not a human. You don't have the right of free speech. Things like, you know, they claim to be people, and yet they're not subject to the laws that we're subject to. One of the things I noted when I wrote my book, a little piece of research that came up is corporations steal $1.4 billion in wages in Los Angeles alone. They just don't pay people. They pay them a little less. They pay them incorrectly. They worked it out to be 1.4 billion. That's theft. But can a company be held to account to that the way a human can? No. No. You could take them to civil court and they could be fined maybe if you succeed. But they're not subject to the same laws that we are, so they shouldn't be claiming the same benefits that we get. Okay, redefining ownership. There's a whole lot of things that can be talked about in here, and we talk about them in separate KCOR talks. But the idea of how we own land. Can land really be owned? I tend to go with Henry George on that. No, I tend to go with the land value tax idea, this idea that we own the improvements to the land, but not the land itself. Economic rentiers that's part of ownership too. An economic rentier is somebody who makes money solely on what they own, not on what they do. So that includes banks. That includes people who hold patents and intellectual property. That includes people who actually rent apartments and get Airbnb properties and rent them out. They are not earning money based on what they do. They're earning money based on what they already have. And if you look at the math of that, it always works out that if you follow the curve, it always goes up because people who own more can buy more and then they will own more, and they will earn more, and so on. And so this whole idea of money through ownership has to be revisited. So there's a bunch of things. But this is the last thing I wanted to talk about here, basic income. Basic income, I think, is hugely, hugely important right now for a number of reasons. One is that it's actually realistic. It's got broad support across the political spectrum. Conservatives are interested in having a basic income. Liberals are interested in having a basic income. Ecologists are interested in having a basic income. And right now, in fact, in the Senate, they are in committee discussing, the Canadian Senate, Bill S-233, which is to study a framework for basic income. Now, Earth for All discovered that one of their key accelerators of getting all their other economic transitions to work was looking at poverty and looking at equality. And so guaranteed basic income certainly addresses poverty, but it addresses so much more than that. It is part of the major models, but it's a philosophical game changer. What do I mean by that? It severs the relationship between my survival and money. This is key to the survival of pretty much everyone on the planet that relies on some form of money to live. If I don't have money, if I don't have jobs, if I don't have economic growth, et cetera, I will not live. I won't have the food I need. I won't have the shelter I need for the most part. Obviously, I could go off and live in the wilds. We'll leave those people out for now. This is why jobs are considered some aspect of modern slavery, because if you don't have a job in our modern techno-industrial society, you won't earn money, you won't eat, you won't have a roof over your heads. Not unless you're an economic rentier and are earning your money through some other method. But an economic rentier always relies on the income for people who do have jobs. So at the end of the day, the jobs are still necessary. This one, the guaranteed basic income, means that I don't have to worry whether I'm going to survive or not if I decide that I can't do this job anymore. If I want to get out of that job and into a different job. If I'm a battered spouse, not working at all, and I need to leave a home. If I'm a university student just graduating and wanting to do further studies, I don't have to find a job. I'm not going to starve. If I was earning a basic income now, I would be giving a lot more of my money away that I have now stored as savings, because I wouldn't worry about it having to support my lifestyle in my later years. This is huge. And I think, as I say, it's a game changer that if we could get people running down this path of removing money as being necessary for survival, then they start questioning other things. What makes my life important? If it's not money, if I can do things that I enjoy doing, that I love doing, what might those things be? I want to cut it off there because I've thrown a bunch of things at you, and I know that my first K-Core talk was basically a fire hose of stuff, and I wanted to try and avoid that. But I'm throwing a bunch of things out there because I want to open up the discussion on some of those basic ideas that are out there and go from there. All right, so over to you, Mike.
I have to get myself back on the screen here. There we go. Yeah, Andrew, we've had a number of questions and comments here. As the host, I get to ask you the first question, and what I wanted to ask is, do you think that a genuine progress index, which accounts for social and environmental as well as economic factors, would be a good start on getting these qualitative values into play?
Before I answer that question, just wondering if somebody can stop my screen share out there, because I am having trouble stopping it. So I'd like to get to see people again. We stop the screen share?
Yeah, leave that with me. I'll do it.
Okay, thank you. All right, the genuine progress indicator. Yeah, it's a different measure, and it measures the right things, but I can't see that it's ever going to be adopted in a way that, because what people talk about when they talk about these major models is different ways of measuring things such that you can now see what's valuable and not valuable. That's great. But measuring them is different from actually making them happen. And if you structure your policies around making a genuine progress indicator happen, then the policies have to change. And that's where you're going to get the pushback. So at the end of the day, yes, you can measure different things, but if you start enacting the actions to make those things actually score higher, they're going to get pushed back. That's my problem with the genuine progress indicator. The UN's been calling for it for years. A number of nations have been looking at it, playing with it, but it hasn't replaced anything yet.
Okay, well, Bill Reese has got questions on a variety of things. I don't know if you want to take them one at a time, Bill, or try to answer them or ask them all together. Richard Vanderjet is on deck.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Andrew. That was very interesting. I have a question. Most of my other stuff are comments, so I won't get into them. But what if this more is better strategy is actually an innate characteristic of human nature? I'm making this case because if you go back to Paleolithic times, people had a real struggle most of the time to get sufficiency. And so those who, I suppose, were more aggressive in the getting of more were the survivors. And the tendency to be that way would be passed on from generation to generation to generation. And by the time we get to civilizations, there isn't any case of any civilization anywhere in which once you have surpluses being produced, we don't get slavery, hierarchies within society where some people simply because of their position and power and wealth get more and more, and a whole bunch of other people get less and less, and so on. So I'm really arguing here that it's going to be very difficult to overcome this tendency, if it is innate, if it is part of human nature, because it's worked for hundreds of thousands of years, and it's only become a hazard in the last couple of hundred years when technology actually made it possible for the vast majority of people to continue to get more and more. And then we've invented things like credit cards and so on that it us to even expend beyond our incomes. So what I'm trying to say is that this more is better is not, it's natural, and it infiltrates all of our instruments of society today, from credit cards to pension plans to everything. So it's just not something you can say, okay, let's just change our minds and do something differently. That ain't going to happen.
Right.
But, yeah.
Well, you've got a lot in there. Let me try and address some of it. I think that to a certain extent, yes, we have struggled for our sufficiency and our ability to, we have to hunt and get food sources and shelter. But the key difference there is that there is sufficiency. Its sufficiency is defined. And once we had scored that bison or whatever, we stopped hunting and we moved on to other things. We spent time in culture and dance and so on. We do have this thing throughout the evolution of civilizations where more is always worth more started to take on greater and greater precedence. I don't think that we can say that that's not a valid value, that it's not a valid system. Because I think that the values themselves exist on this polarity where more is always worth more has its place, and qualitative values have their place. The problem is that we don't use qualitative values to make decisions anymore. We only use more is always worth more, and that's unsustainable. All right, that's because we lose that balance. The other key difference, I think, is when you look at civilizations existing as a part of nature, as they always have done, but more recognizably so than perhaps now, the other shoe is going to drop. More is always worth more is actually a natural property in some sense. When you look at a rabbit population, more rabbits is always better. That's why rabbits are constantly reproducing. The difference is that nature has a feedback mechanism. It provides negative feedback, which is why the planet is not covered with rabbits. So that curve is actually something that comes down again on the other side. Our problem as humans is that we believe there is no negative feedback. We've defeated disease. We've defeated limited food supply. We've defeated not being able to live in really hot conditions or really cold conditions. So we think that there is no negative feedback. And by pushing all of that aside, our more has always been worth more, and there's been no feedback. One of the
making my
maybe
point.
the radical thoughts that I present is that climate change is nature's negative feedback. Climate change is that process in nature. As I said, there's nothing in nature that is an exponential curve that only goes up. Climate change is the natural curve of nature saying, okay, there's too many humans. I'm going to use their power against them by turning that more is always worth more into their downfall.
Thank you. You've actually helped to make my point, and I make that point later on in some of my comments. That, in fact, with fossil fuel in the 19th century, we did eliminate many of the negative feedbacks, but that simply freed our innate expansionist and more tendencies for the first time in human evolutionary history. People think that the last 200 years of growth is normal, as you pointed out. It's the complete opposite. This is the single most abnormal period in human history, simply because we can continue to expand, having temporarily defeated negative feedback. And the point I make later on is that techno-industrial society will destroy our habitat to the point that it will push back and force an adaptive strategy to any survivors of that great contraction. So thank you.
So people say that people like us are doomsayers because we're on this track downwards of we're going to have lots of people dying and lots of people homeless and poverty and war and strife. Yes, because we have to go in that cycle to go up to the other side. One of the things that I got funnily optimistic about with the Earth for All presentation when she said, we're talking to the government of the Ukraine right now about a whole different set of policies for when they rebuild. And that was very exciting. But it also said to me that the current system has to be reduced to zero and nullified before you can institute an entirely new set of policies that people can say, oh yeah, maybe this would really work for us. Should we move on?
Okay, Richard, you have a comment, and Samrat, you've got a comment afterwards.
Yes, thanks. I had an opportunity years ago at a fundraiser to ask Stephen Lewis about having a minimum guaranteed income, and he at that time said, yeah, I think there is some support within government. Some of my MP colleagues that yeah, there should be a minimum guaranteed. Jeffrey Simpson wrote about it in his one of his books, that actually if you implement a minimum guaranteed income, then people will have housing, they'll have a decent nutrition, and so forth. I mean, and in the end, it would actually do more to benefit healthcare than or people's general health than any other measure. But I still wonder what it is within our federal government that stops us from implementing that. I think there was an experiment in Manitoba some years ago, and it seemed to work well. I think a lot of people were afraid that people would stop working and, I'll just have my minimum basic income. But that didn't happen. And so I still wonder what stops government from implementing that.
I think the difficulty is that because there have been lots of projects and pilot projects around the world, and they've pretty much shown that those negative impacts don't occur. The problem is that it's still often perceived within the numeric value system as these people are getting something for nothing, which is exactly what it is. But in our old system of thinking, that's not fair because I have to work for my money and they're not. I think that one of the things that doesn't often come up, I mean, people talk about basic income as curing poverty because it's putting money in people's pockets, but it does more than that. There was a study in Stockton, California, where they were giving people $250 a month. And that's nothing, nothing, $250 a month. But the thing was that gesture had a huge amount of value. The people were going, wow, the government believes I have value. They believe I have worth. I'm going to spend that $250 to get a new suit and go out and interview for a job. People turned their lives around based on a very small amount of money. It wasn't the money that was turning the lives around. It was the difference in attitude, the difference in value that was perceived to society. And I think that's huge. I think that can't be overstated.
Yeah, I still wonder what stops our federal government from, because
well, they're talking about it now. The U.S. almost had a basic income 50 years ago. Milton Friedman proposed it, of all people. They almost put it in under Nixon. So I think we're close. I think we're close. And I think an interesting thing just on the topic that helps sell basic income was COVID-19. Because there we had an example where the government was giving money to everybody based on the crisis, and people saw what they were doing with it and how they were able to survive based on it. And they said, maybe we should do this more often. Maybe we should make this a permanent thing. So I'm optimistic about it, but I think it's the kind of thing that needs to be pushed more by people like KCOR and people like Earth for All and so on. Yeah. Next.
Okay, Samrat, you're next, and David Pollock had a comment question afterwards. Samrat.
Yeah, hi Andrew. Really nice, strong presentation. I really resonate with it. My question is like, in context of the circular diagram that you just have behind you right now, it makes me feel, maybe I'm wrong, but I want to know, is current form of economics then contrary to ecology? You know, like you have economics on one side and the ecological well-being is on the other side. Yeah.
Yes, I believe it is, unless the economy or the economic principles that you're based on have this sense of sufficiency in either pole, they are running contrary to this model. And another interesting thing about this model is that I take it from business, is it Polarity Management by Barry Johnson. What they discovered about things that are polarities is that if you try and exist on one pole, let's say you've got, what's an example I often use? Freedom. Freedom can be a qualitative value that can be mapped on this. And how do you get freedom? Well, it depends on the context of where you are now. If you're in an authoritarian regime, all right, so there's an authoritarian regime down here, and you don't like it, what you want is more liberty. You want more ability to do what you feel like doing, not what someone tells you to do. So you move in this direction. But the problem is, if you have too much liberty and everyone is doing what they want to do, you start to infringe on the rights of others. So you say, well, wait a minute, we need some rules. We need some ways of saying, you can do what you want to do so long as it doesn't hurt me. And when you start to put in the rules, then you start to potentially head, if you have too many rules, sorry, I'm not drawing this right. I should know this a lot better. Liberty, you start to get in anarchy because everyone's doing what they want to do and you don't like that. So you want to introduce some rules over here. But when you have too many rules, you start running into an authoritarian regime. So freedom is actually a polarity between order and chaos, or liberty, depending on what words you want to use. There will never be a perfect balance of order and chaos such that you have freedom defined that works for everybody at all times. It's got to be constantly shifting back and forth based on context. So if your economic principles have only one rule where more is always better, there is no concept of sufficiency, and you're trying to apply them on a planet that's finite. It has finite resources. There has to be sufficiency. Otherwise, you're going to run the planet to zero. That's just basic math.
Okay, thanks so much. Yeah.
Okay, David Pollack, you're on, and Ted Manning to follow.
Well, it was just a minor point in the whole scope of the presentation, but in relation to the basic income, it was just a cautionary note that to curtail enthusiasm a little bit. You know, we have the Ford government that immediately killed the experiment that was going on in Ontario. We have the leader of the Progressive Conservative Party not at all supportive or interested. Now, that's not to say that the great sort of crusade work of Hugh Segal is not important, and I think he's gathered quite a bit of support within the Canadian Senate. So the idea is out there, but I think it will take more hardship probably will help to bring it in the sense that if we have more and more struggles to employ the middle class, AI may make it more difficult to have employment as fully as we need it to have purchasing power and to create some sense of social cohesion and not have social breakdown. I mean, those things may in fact force governments in that direction. So I can see the day may come, and I agree with you that it would be a major breakthrough in terms of the other kinds of changes that it could support. But I just think that that day at a national level within Canada is still quite far distant. That's my comment.
Yep, I think you're right, because I think that it threatens the current structure and hierarchy of power. Absolutely. So there are going to be people that have a real problem with that. Also, to be fair, if your mindset is entirely within what we were trained up and educated throughout our entire lives, that more is always better, it's very difficult to see the flip side. It's what I call in the value crisis study, I call it the value conundrum. And that is that we want to shift value systems, but the only way we can see the benefits of the second value system is if we have already adopted it. If you're still in the first value system, you will not see the benefits in the other one. And I often give this example of governments putting in paper recycling programs because they want to recycle paper. But yet, as soon as the pulp and paper mill is threatened, they look for other markets for that paper, ways of keeping those jobs. You have to appreciate that what is good in one value system is probably going to be bad in the other. You've got to choose which value system you're on because they're opposites. And that's one of the reasons why it's very difficult to make that transition. And one of the reasons why COVID-19 was so valuable, because it threw us into thinking, what's really important about life here? My job or other things?
No, I agree with all of what you've just said. Yep. Thanks.
Welcome. Thank you.
Okay, Ted and Dave Doherty on deck.
Yeah, this follows very well what David Corton tried to set us off on, which was you can't eat money. And that started what some of the other people have presented, and one that I have put on, by the way, on this week's website, if anybody wants to look at it. It's the work that some of us, including David Pollack, who's here, and Anitra Thorhog, been working on to try and identify that there are other value systems and that perhaps we can transcend our obsession with GNP or just the use of money as a metric. I put some comments on here. I didn't mean to put them in all caps. I'm not yelling at anybody. But that said, the problem we've had all the way through, and I've worked with the indicators work in UN, including the stuff on SDGs for a while, is if you can't measure something, you can't really talk about it. And it's really hard to even explain its existence or even to talk about more. How do you in fact define more? What's enough? So we in many ways are captured by our metrics, and too often our metrics are just money. And as you have very cleverly illustrated, there are many other aspects to this. So the question really is, can we develop a vernacular that actually captures what people believe are the most important values in their lives? And are they prepared to trade it for money? Because right now that is the common vernacular. We don't talk about so many lives. We try and cost lives and talk about how much it would cost us to save them. Strikes me as a little weird. Anyway, thank you for stimulating these questions, Andrew.
Well, I'd like to address a couple of those comments too. That the first thing is that metrics are useful and important. It's not that numbers themselves are bad. It's that metrics don't define more is always better. So if you set a sustainable development goal, which has some level of sufficiency, where it says this is how much everybody has to earn per day, or this is how much everybody has to eat per day, it's not only okay, it's necessary to do those metrics and measure how well are we doing in terms of people hitting that goal. But the goal is not that people have more and more food. That's not the measure of success. The measure of success is having sufficiency. So I think that one of what I think might be my more significant potentially contributions to this conversation is the idea that while we can't measure freedom, we can now at least graph it. We can't measure joy and beauty or justice, but we can now graph it, and we can now show why some of those sustainable development goals are in conflict, and that's not a bad thing necessarily. We just have to move between what's contextually appropriate in that moment. That's the way nature works. Sometimes there's more lynxes, sometimes there's more snowshoe hares, and that's end of the day. If you're moving from there to there, a bunch of hares are going to die.
Thanks, Andrew. It's all trade-offs, I'm afraid. Thank you.
There is.
Okay, Dave, you're on, and Paul Beckwith, you're on deck.
Interesting. Thank you. Just on your last comment, a bunch of hares are going to die. Well, no matter what, hares are going to die. Anything that gets born is going to die.
Yep.
A bunch of lynxes are going to die too. I wanted to bring up something that I just discovered in the news this week. A bunch of scientists, 9 I believe, have published a new paper, and they're saying that there is a new biological principle which ought to be seen alongside Darwin's principle of natural selection and evolution. And it holds that complex natural systems evolve to states of greater patterning, diversity, and complexity. And I think you can actually read into that growth. And you could put that in a different way, which is more. So if they're correct, my question is more natural?
Complexity, more difficult to say. Complexity is a qualitative value. So I don't think you can measure complexity with a number necessarily. And so more complexity, I would hesitate to say that more complexity is always the natural goal, because I think nature, while it heads towards more complexity, it also heads in some cases towards more simplicity as being more powerful. Before I get to that, I want to challenge you on the first thing you actually said, though. Everything that's born dies. Well, look at these things that don't. Money does not die. Now, that's significant for a couple of reasons in a second. Corporations don't die. They can theoretically live forever. These are myths, if you go by Harari's writings, because they're concepts that we invented that are just stories, and stories can go on forever and ever. money doesn't die means that a couple of things. If you are a billionaire and you acquire billions and billions of dollars, and when you have kids, well, you die, but the money doesn't. So you could pass on that billion to the next kid, and they can turn that into a trillionaire, and they can pass that into the next generations, and so on. Same thing with corporations. Because they never die, they could theoretically keep growing and growing and growing. Right now, we're at the point where it's conceivably possible that one corporation could own everything. That is conceivably possible because of the way we have defined that myth. So these things are unnatural. And so just keep that in mind when you say that everything that's born also dies. If they're number-based, numbers never die.
Okay, so my observations on this. First, neither money nor corporations is born, nor hatched, nor budded, or any other biological form of coming into being. Those are constructs. They're artificial, as you actually just said. They're artificial.
That's correct, yeah.
Certainly, money, it only exists in the abstract, in a sense. Yep. Gold, on the other hand, or any other commodity that you would want to put in it, doesn't necessarily have monetary value, but it will continue to exist as long as the earth is here, because it's gold is an element, and we don't know any form of transmutation for same. Corporations, on the other hand, I would argue are quite a different kettle of fish. Mm-hmm. And I would like to have a government that isn't going to die, that isn't going to declare bankruptcy, that isn't going to go away, whereas the opposite, corporations, in fact, always go away. We have no corporations that have lasted hundreds of years.
That's not true. There's a corporation in France that's lasted 650 years.
Okay, well, I'm completely unaware of that one. But the idea of a corporation doesn't even go back 600 years. The oldest one of which I was aware was the Hudson Bay Corporation, but it's been reincarnated. It's been brought up from the ashes. It's really a completely different company. There are, I'll look into this thing from France, but to my knowledge, there are no corporations that are old. They all, because they're managed by people and people make mistakes, every corporation makes mistakes. And they all die.
Only because they've made a mistake.
That's
There's
correct.
There's nothing in the creation of the myth that says it has to die.
Correct. That's correct. Don't argue that.
And when we talk about hundreds of years, the transitions that have happened in hundreds of years are nothing like the transition that's happened in the last 50. So the scope, the growth is accelerating. Everything is accelerating at a faster and faster pace. So to say how long it used to take something to survive or die is not necessarily meaningful going forward. But I think we may be running to the end of we get into the weeds on this one. Maybe I should open it up to some more questions. But I'll send you some information on that French company for a start. You might like to look at that.
Great, thanks.
Mike.
Okay, Paul, your comment is up, and Claude Boutner, you're on deck.
Yeah, okay, thank you, Andrew. So, yeah, I think that guaranteed basic income will become mandatory for all countries when technologies like AI, for example, allowing full self-driving cars are implemented, because, it'll be a sort of abrupt change, an abrupt loss of many, many hundreds of thousands of jobs. So, there'll be anarchy and civil unrest, et cetera, if, there's no outlet, nothing like, if there's nothing like guaranteed basic income to tide those people over, they're just unemployable, basically. And maybe you can comment on a couple of my other things I'd like you to comment on are, we've always, since humans evolved, and have had fingers, we've always counted things, and it's a way of understanding the world. So I think, rather than trying to get rid of a number-based system, we need to sort of enhance it and start counting things that are more important to us, like the idea of, instead of GDP, global, happiness indexes and things like that. And I guess maybe, as there's more and more people on the planet, and as there's more and more conflict for natural resources because of overshoot and climate change and all these other things, the value of human life seems to be plummeting right now, right?
Yeah.
I mean, there's no, look at the 2 million people in Gaza. They're given almost no value of their lives by not just Israel, but all of the cheerleaders in the West, like Biden and Trudeau and all the Western countries that are cheerleading behind Israel, whatever they do. Now, I mean, I know the world felt sorry for Israel and for Jews because of the Holocaust. That was in 1940s, right? And 6 million massacred. So since then, there's been a lot of things that, a lot of things that they could get away with that no other country in the world would get away with. And I think we're kind of seeing that. I mean, this is not a war, Gaza. This is not a war. This is a slaughter. This is a massacre. Yeah. You've got one of the most sophisticated, right? So the value of human life is very, very important. And I guess as we rely more and more on AI, that may actually make the value of human life even less, very quickly.
The value of, sorry, yes, you want to finish that?
Yeah, no. So I'm going. So the value crisis. I think a lot of it is the cheapening value of human life is a big part of it.
Yeah, you know what? I'm going to push back a little bit on that, because I don't think that the way we value human life has changed as much as what the relationships are that we have. And I say that because I will often throw this out as a challenge when I speak to congregations and so on in churches. I'll say, what's more valuable, one life or 100? And they'll say, well, obviously 100 lives are worth more. I mean, it's the old trolley problem. But I say, what if the one life was your granddaughter? How does that change your perspective? I also bring up often this example of the Syrian refugee crisis. The numbers were climbing, thousands of people, tens of thousands of people were being displaced, and it was just a number. But one child washes up on a beach, and we see that face, and we can associate that with something, and we have a relationship there that's psychological, and suddenly our borders are opening up, and we're bringing in Syrian refugees. So it's not so much, to my mind, that the value that we place on human life has gone down. It's that we have lost the relationships that we used to have. I think that the value that we place on the people we know is still what it always used to be. It's just that we can impact a lot more people in a lot worse ways now through well, it's always been that way in war and so on. But when we lose that relationship that comes by having trade with face-to-face rather than trade being a click on your shopping cart and so on, all of these things tend to devalue relationships in human lives.
Thank you.
That's what I'd say to that. Who's up next?
Claude's up next, and we'll jump to Raymond Leary before we go to people who've already spoken. So, Claude.
And so my comment was really a summary of what was going on in the conversation. And I hope, Bill, you're ready, because you gave an excellent comment that added more depth to it, basically as overshoot and the, well, here, are you there, Bill? Maybe you could take over. Overshoot will generate feedback that crushes the overshoot. So I think we're both on the same page, but he has more depth to his comments that that is our feedback. We are experiencing our feedback right now. So
absolutely.
Okay. So
absolutely.
Maybe we're all just repeating and using different words.
No, and I think that when I said at the beginning of the talk that I'm an optimist, what's exciting to me is that, remember that value conundrum, that you will never change your value system until you can see the benefits of the new value system, and you will never see the benefits while you're still in your old value system. If the carpet is pulled out from under your current value system, in other words, if we have massive climate change, if we have economic chaos, if we have
I don't think that's if, but that's
and we
when.
will,
Yeah.
and we will, you see the potential for people saying, holy smokes, the way we have been doing things is not the way that's going to keep us going into the future. And I think that, I don't think there's any question that that other shoe is going to drop, because I don't think there's any question that we can take the actions necessary for all of the reasons I've already listed. Nobody wants those actions under our old value system. Nobody wants to do all the changes that we have to make. Even though they like the look of them, in principle, they don't want to give up what they've already got. And in many cases, it may be already too late. And there's going to be such a massive pushback from the people who are in the decision-making capacity to prevent those changes from taking place, that it's going to have to be pretty sad before we can see any change. Yeah, I'm in that camp. I'm with you guys.
If I can just add another 10 seconds.
Yeah.
I was listening to Marshall McLuhan from 1965 recently, and someone asked him, like, well, where does all this end? Because he's talking about the electric age, which he said started when commercial telegraph came into being around 1844. And he says, basically, stasis. It'll get so complex and so fast, basically things will start falling apart. I think of the house of cards that we all played with as kids.
Yeah.
You know, to demonstrate that there at some point where you don't know what's going to trigger it, but it's going to collapse.
Yeah.
Anyway, so I don't know if that's the context that he had in mind, but he certainly was worried about the future.
Well, stasis is an interesting word for it, because stasis sounds bleak and fixed. But when you think about it in the bigger picture, isn't that what sustainability is? Is humankind existing at a fairly comfortable, flat, plateauing level of as one with the ecology. Stasis might also describe how the First Nations people lived in North America for thousands of years. You might think, well, they were pretty static, I guess, because they didn't develop space travel. But they developed in different directions. They developed in a qualitative sense. And I think, as a matter of fact, something I recently stumbled upon, and I don't know that I've talked about it with KCOR before, but it's a concept I get from Robert Reich, where we have three value personae that are always in conflict with each other. There is the consumer that wishes to consume things. They want low prices. They look after our present needs. There is the investor who looks after our future needs. And those are the investor side of us is the one that puts money away for future days and wants to see high prices and growth. And then there's the citizen value personae, which looks after others. And I suddenly realized that if you look at, and this talks to the evolution of life, how life has evolved on the planet from simplicity to complexity. If you look at the earliest life forms, all they knew was consumerism. All they knew was eating and getting their needs met. And as life evolved, we started to get this idea of the investor set, which started thinking about the future. That's the squirrels putting their chestnuts away for the colder part of the season. But thinking ahead, that's the investor life evolution. And then at our level, as primates, we evolved to this level where we cared about other of our species. So that was the citizen value personae coming into play. I suspect that there may be a fourth level of the evolution that we are on the cusp of, where we will realize that we are interconnected with everything else in nature. Perhaps that is the fourth level of value that we haven't reached yet. Throw that out there.
Okay, I'm just saying that the stasis won't be at 8 billion, because all the modeling says that stasis was a possibility maybe when we were at 2 billion, and we are well beyond that.
Yeah, interesting when you talk about population. One of the things that came up in the Earth for All discussion is whether we change or not. They still said the population was likely to peak at around 11 billion or so, and then start dropping off, and that would be taking the pressure off our resources. Now That does not take the pressure off our resources. If you get to 11 billion somehow, the planet can sustain that, and then you start dropping down and you eventually make it to 8 billion, that gets to where we are right now. They're still consuming non-renewable resources. So there was also a question that came up in 30 years ago. Buzz Nixon was asking this question of KCOR. He said, why is nobody doing serious work on figuring out how many people the planet can actually support? What is sufficiency? We don't care about sufficiency so much that we have no idea what would be the appropriate number for a planet. We really don't.
Including
Again,
your
we're getting into the
research?
weeds.
And, yeah, I know, but include now. I was going to say thank you very much, but now you've stimulated the next question. You personally have been, because you know that this is an unanswered question. What's the best that you've heard? Because I've heard everything from 2 down to 500 million.
Oh, that's way above my pay grade.
Okay.
As Mike said at the opening of the talk, my superpower is that I don't have the education. I don't have the focus on disciplines that would force me to think in certain directions. So I just stand on the shoulders of everybody else.
If Bill was still here, he could tell us about how many hectares per person.
Yeah,
and,
exactly.
After the degradation. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Very welcome.
And I had trouble finding my notes. You have really stimulated a storm of comments. Thank you so much, Andrew.
Thank you.
Yeah, Bill will get a chance in a bit, but right now, Raymond Lurie and Samrat would be on deck.
Hi, Andrew. Thanks very much for a very, very thought-provoking discussion. So I've got a comment, but I'll turn it into a question if I can. When I was, like I said in the comments there, when I was much younger, I was really, really driven by this insecurity, financial insecurity. And until I retired, actually, which was just 5 years ago, a lot of my behavior was driven by wanting to have financial security, right? So I see your point about the guaranteed income helps with that, right? But I see other trends like wanting to have more stuff, forget about the money, but having bigger houses and all this kind of stuff. And I still see young people today, regardless of their awareness of environmental issues or not, they're pursuing those goals, right? So how could we sow the seed that's going to get people to think differently about this? And from my perspective, maybe I'm an exception, but I don't think I'm that much of an exception. This financial insecurity drove my behavior for 40 years.
Yeah.
Okay. And he would have had trouble convincing me that I needed to change, right? So how can we get people to do things that are fundamentally better for the planet?
Well, to be fair, I think the first thing that I would say is that you were not actually driven by financial security as the base level that was driving you. You were driven by a need to survive, a desire to be able to afford to live. And so what followed from that was financial security, because you have linked, as the world has, financial security to your living, to your survival. But I think that when you say, how do we get the next generation off of this idea that stuff is the be all and end all and we need more stuff? God, that's a huge question. It's the tsunami that every force out there is driving us towards. How could they not want to live that way? Because that's the message they are getting each and every day. And so, there are things that I do. One of the things that I wrote about actually in the second book, I called it Our Second Chance, and it's not so much what we've talked about today. It's not a lot of the huge picture world global economics. It's very much an individual approach. What can I do as an individual to start acquiring these values? And it's things as simple as if instead of letting your income determine your lifestyle, let your desired lifestyle determine your income. If you can set a sufficiency on what do I need to have a good life, then you can say, yeah, you know what? I sat down, did the math. I only have to work 3 days a week. So I'm only going to work 3 days a week because I have the lifestyle that I want, to try and get out of that, what they call hedonistic adaptation, where every time we earn more, we decide I can buy a more expensive property, which puts me in a more expensive neighborhood, which means that all the people around me are doing more expensive things than I do. So I want to be them. It has to break that cycle. It lists a whole bunch of approaches. To some, it's as simple as starting a garden. I'm big on that, starting a vegetable garden. Why? Because that will teach you more about life than anything else. You can plant 1,000 seedlings and only 100 are going to come up. And actually, they're going to come up better by pulling out the other 900 yourself. You learn these things about what's important and how we measure value differently. So I've struggled with it. I came up with the second book for that, but there is no easy answer to that question. Absolutely not. Not unless the current system fails and the kids go, wow, you really ruined this for me. I'm not going to live the way you lived. Greta Thunberg put it nicely when she said, COVID-19 showed us that climate change was never treated as an emergency. Because if it was, you'd be doing the kind of crap you did with COVID-19, and you're not.
Yeah. I'm concerned that there's very little incentive for anybody to put their foot off the accelerator because they don't see the consequences, and they people are very selfish, right? But anyways, thank you very much.
Consequences are coming. Thank you, Raymond.
Okay, we said Bill Reese could have another comment, and then we're going to wrap it up. But stick around because we'll have an informal discussion after we close off the recording, and
Sure.
There may be much more to be talked about. Thank you, Bill.
Thanks very much, Mike. Actually, you can just read all of my comments. I would summarize this way, that human beings don't understand themselves. We are creatures of evolution, and most of the problems that are coming to the fruit right now are the results of innate human behaviors that had huge adaptive value in Paleolithic times, but have simply become maladaptive with the advent of advanced technology, which have in fact freed us from the negative feedbacks that nature once imposed. We are not going to voluntarily change. I don't think you will see any country be the leader in voluntarily downsizing their populations or their economies for all the reasons that were mentioned earlier by Andrew. There's huge power nexus here that we haven't even talked about. Those with the money and the power aren't going to give it up anytime soon. People don't realize that most of the events that are happening on the news today are the results of overshoot. The crisis in the Middle East, too damn many people, not enough land or resources. Very simple. We're not willing to give the Palestinians a few hectares of land to call their own. What else do we need to say about it? And as you look at all of the other so-called crises, the food crisis that's emerging in Africa, it's overpopulation, etc., etc. So until we come to grips with human nature and what we do naturally as primitive Paleolithic beings, we're not going to solve any of these problems. In fact, I think Andrew's made the point that we're not going to solve these problems until overshoot hits us so hard that literally hundreds of millions of people are going to go down with the punch. And maybe that'll be sufficient to wake the rest of the world up to adopting a different way of being. By the way, the steady state or stasis is an idea that's been around at least since Herman Daly. If you read his book, Steady State Economics, it simply recognizes that the ecosphere can handle a certain level of what is called economic throughput, consumption of energy and materials, and the production of wastes. And if human beings were willing to live within the carrying capacity of the planet, whatever the carrying capacity of population number, and as several people have commented, that depends on our average material standard. Probably 1 billion to 2 billion people could live very well in a steady state economy within the productive and assimilative capacities of the ecosphere. But as Andrew has said, 10 billion, 8 billion cannot. We're already in a vast situation of overshoot where the current rate of growth is being sustained by the consumption and depletion of vital natural assets. How stupid is that? Humans aren't intelligent. We are instinctive survivors. And those who will survive are those who have the most power and wealth when the crunch comes. The rest of us, hold on to your hats, folks. Sorry, I rattled on a bit.
Well, I'm glad
And on
to
that
see
cheery
you.
note,
I'm glad to see you acknowledging that some may survive. It's a step forward, but it's going to be rough times. Okay, Ted, you're going to take over from here, and thank you, Andrew, and everybody. It's been a great discussion.
Yeah, thank you very much, Andrew and Mike. It's another of our really stimulating sessions, and a very good reason to read the book we have produced called Plan to Survive, and which we desperately wish to upgrade to be able to address all of these questions. I think, yeah, they're going to put on the commercial, so I can tell you that we are going to have another one very quickly. David Harries is with us on the 25th of October, and he'll be talking about Goalkeeping 2045 Sustainable Development Third Try. My guess is that it will expand on these kinds of issues of how we actually get the world to do anything. And that, of course, is a very strongly shared concern that we have all expressed today. And Andrew, that was really wonderful. You can tell how well it went simply because of the huge list of really stimulating questions you got, and we're delighted to have had you present it. I'll simply say that the last part of the commercial is, if you are not a member, we would like you to be, because we do have to pay for the computer to keep the stuff going and to make sure that these things last right through. We do have to pay for the guy who helps us get these all set up. And we also would like you to subscribe on our YouTube channel. We're doing pretty well there. Certain people, like Bill being one of them, have put literally thousands of views in front of these things. So I think we are winning, and we would like to keep doing that. That said, we are now going to turn off the recording, and we will just leave it open for general discussion for the next 20 minutes or so. And we would urge everybody now to, the moment this recording says off, please put your video and your sound back on, and we can all continue to talk with each other. So thanks again for coming. We'll see many of you next week.